Dan McClellan claims that the prohibitions of man-male intercourse in Leviticus 18 and 20 has no moral relevance outside the land of Israel, nor do the accompanying prohibitions of incest, adultery, bestiality, and child sacrifice. Dan confidently asserts that these are not universal moral standards, and that Yahweh has no moral qualms with these actions outside the land of Israel, at least for Gentiles, possibly also for Jews. Is this Data Dan talking, or Dogma Dan? That's the question that we're going to explore in this video as we continue our rejoinder to McClellan's responding to Robert Gagnon. Hi, my name is Robert Gagnon, and I am a professor of Bible at Wesley Biblical Seminary in Ridgeland, Mississippi. I've been publishing on the Bible and homosexual practice for a quarter century, starting with a 500-page book on the subject and many publications thereafter. McClellan, for his part, has written a single 24-page chapter on the subject. This video is part 3 of my rejoinder to Dan McClellan's 44-minute responding to Robert Gagnon. Part 1 was a rejoinder to his remarks on Jesus. Part 2 was a rejoinder to his remarks on toavah, abomination, in Leviticus. His responding to Robert Gagnon was a response to my 34-minute video entitled Rob Gagnon Refutes Dan McClellan on Homosexual Practice and Abominations, which in turn was a response to McClellan's 5-minute video entitled Responding to Claims about Homosexuality and Abominations. I also did a 35-minute video entitled Dan McClellan's Take on Jesus and Homosexuality, responding to McClellan's 10-minute video, Did Jesus Say Anything About Homosexuality? McClellan has been ignoring my video since on that subject. Now back to McClellan's claim that the sex offenses in Leviticus 18 and 20 were morally irrelevant outside of the land of Israel. McClellan, attempting to justify why he had wrongly insisted that the sex offenses in Leviticus 18 were abominations not to Yahweh, but to the land of Israel, contends, citing Leviticus scholar Jacob Milgram, that these prohibitions do not represent, quote, universal morality. Rather,
Jacob Milgram agrees with me.
No, Dan, you agree with Jacob Milgram. All your work on the Bible and homosexuality is derivative of somebody else. But do carry on.
That these passages in Leviticus 18 and 20 are limited only to male same-sex intercourse, are limited only to same-sex intercourse taking place within the land of Israel, and are limited only to members of the house of Israel.
What a bizarre interpretation. Note that the sex prohibitions are not limited only to members of the house of Israel. The summary statement in Leviticus 18:26 and the opening remark in Leviticus 20, verse 2, make clear that these sex prohibitions apply also to resident aliens or sojourners, foreigners, in the land of Israel.
Nothing about these prohibitions that apply to anyone outside the land of Israel who is not a member of the house of Israel.
Oh, so you are going to apply the prohibitions to Jews outside the land of Israel, are you? Milgram doesn't. He says, quote, compliance with this law is a condition for residing in the Holy Land, but not elsewhere. If the punishment is solely being expelled from the land, it would not apply to Jews outside Israel, would it? If McClellan, unlike Milgram, is applying the sex prohibitions in Leviticus 18 and 20 to Jews outside the land of Israel, this would be an unconscious admission by McClellan that these prohibitions aren't just about what happens in the land of Israel. McClellan is evidently confused.
And this raises one of my big concerns with Gagnon's attempt to assert the universality of this morality, because God doesn't seem to care about any of these same-sex acts taking place in other nations. God only cares if it happens on the land of Israel, which means that there's something about this taking place in Israel that is foundational to the concern that God has.
But, as we just noted, If God only cares if it happens in the land of Israel, why did McClellan indicate that the sex laws apply outside the land of Israel to members of the house of Israel? In that case, God would also care if his people violate these laws outside the land of Israel. Now, is this the most likely interpretation of the biblical data? Namely, that the sex prohibitions are applicable only to Jews, maybe even only to Jews in the land of Israel? That these behaviors are not abominations to Yahweh outside the land of Israel? Or is this another self-evident case where McClellan chooses the least likely interpretation of the data because it fits his LGBTQ dogma to restrict the moral relevance of the prohibition of homosexual practice to Israel? As we shall see, McClellan tries to force the biblical text to conform to the LGBTQ dogma that in the Bible it is not true that
any and all homosexual practice is universally and eternally condemned. The text doesn't support that at all.
Let's face it, McClellan likely wouldn't be taking such an improbable position were it not for its impact on the issue of homosexuality. So clearly, it's LGBTQ dogma over biblical data for McClellan, not just with regard to Jesus, but also with regard to the interpretation of the Levitical prohibitions of man-male intercourse. Regarding McClellan's appeal to Jacob Milgrom, I got to tell you, I feel bad for Milgrom that he had to adopt such a manifestly untenable position. It sullied his reputation as a scholar. Milgrom, who wrote the 3-volume commentary on Leviticus for the Yale Anchor Bible series, was normally a sure-footed commentator on Leviticus, but not in his attempts to narrow the application of the prohibition of homosexual practice. And it is not the only silly interpretation that Milgrom adopted as regards the Levitical prohibitions on man-male intercourse. Milgrom also took the manifestly untenable position that Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 were prohibiting only incestuous homosexual unions. That's right. In Milgrom's mind, the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 would not have had an issue with two males having sexual intercourse unless they were close blood relations. Does McClellan want to adopt that absurd position too? Milgrom arrived at these preposterous conclusions because he was caught between a rock and a hard place. That is, between his personal reverence for Scripture, on the one hand, and a dogmatic desire to let marginalized homosexual Jews biblically off the hook, on the other. How bad is the argument that Yahweh doesn't find the sexual offenses in Leviticus 18 and 20 to be morally wrong outside the land of Israel? Only someone committed to LGBTQ dogma over biblical data would ever make that kind of argument. So let's detail now the 5 reasons why. First, saying that Yahweh regards incest, adultery, and bestiality, child sacrifice, along with man-male intercourse, as abominations to his holiness only if they are committed in the land of Israel is, let's face it, crazy. You are seriously telling me that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 did not think that Yahweh had any moral problem with someone having sex with their own mother or child, or with an animal, unless it was committed in the promised land? Is that the position that you want to sell, Dan? By analogy, murder or homicide, when not dealt with, also leads to defilement of the land, according to Numbers 35, verses 33 to 34. So God doesn't have a problem with homicide outside the land of Israel? Really? Given that the prohibitions in Leviticus 18 are abominations to Yahweh and to his holiness, not, or at least not just, to the land of Israel, as McClellan was forced to admit by my arguments, it's self-evident that they remain abominations to Yahweh, even when they are done outside the land of Israel. As McClellan's own admission that the sex laws applied to Jews outside the land of Israel concedes. In short, it's not the venue of the land of Israel that makes these prohibited sexual acts toavot, abominations, to Yahweh, but it's the nature of the acts themselves which are toavot in relation to Yahweh's holiness. As an aside, it bears mentioning that the penalty prescribed for committing these sexual abominations is not limited to the national penalty of being vomited out of the land of Israel, but it includes also individual penalties for individual acts. Per Leviticus 18:29, individuals who commit these abominations are threatened with being, quote, cut off from their people, unquote. Leviticus 20 prescribes an array of punishments to befall individuals prior to any expulsion from Canaan. Capital sentencing, being cut off from one's own people, and being made childless. What precipitates from Yahweh a strong response of expulsion from the land is the special holiness of the land of Israel, which is due to Yahweh's special holy presence in the land. But that special presence did not turn morally acceptable behaviors into morally wrong behaviors. It was already wrong behavior. And this leads to our second point. The statement opening Leviticus 18, quote, you shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, unquote, verse 2, presupposes that Yahweh finds detestable and abhorrent the incest, adultery, bestiality, man-male intercourse, and child sacrifice committed by Egyptians in the land of Egypt. Yahweh is not telling the Israelites in Leviticus 18 to abstain from all Egyptian conduct, just the immoral or idolatrous conduct of the Egyptians in the land of Egypt. If the conduct were not detestable and abhorrent in Egypt, there would be no reason to prohibit it in the land of Israel. Now, would there? Third point, an absence of uniform judgment is not the same as the absence of universal morality. While God may not at once discipline the nations of the world for their sins or discipline them in the same way or to the same degree, it doesn't make their sins non-sins. Assigning a specific punishment to a specific group in a specific place is not the same as saying that morality is not universal. The fact that Israel has no power as a nation to implement capital sentencing in other nations that violate these sex laws is not proof that these acts are not egregious sins outside the land of Israel in Yahweh's eyes. An example, if I told my own children when they were young not to do X because X is a big sin, and that if they do X, they will be disciplined, that does not mean that I think it's okay for children outside my family to do X just because I don't discipline them. If it is a moral wrong for my children, then it's more than likely a moral wrong for other children as well. Fourth point. While McClellan claims that
in the pre-exilic period, Adonai's purview was only conceptualized as extending as far as the boundaries of Israel,
there are biblical texts showing that Yahweh had ultimate oversight over the whole world. Compare the figure of El, God, in the Canaanite pantheon, known as the Judge, as well as the Father of humankind and the Creator of heaven and earth. Already in the pre-exilic period, in Genesis 18, narrative material that literary critical scholars attribute to J, the Yahwist, Abraham, when haggling with God over the destruction of Sodom, asks rhetorically, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? He says that as though it's a widely assumed point, that Yahweh is the judge of all the earth. The very first extant writing prophet, Amos, Pre-exilic, mid-8th century BC, operates on the view that the judgment of other nations is standard for Yahweh. What Amos adds that is new is the theme of the divine warrior's march against even Israel. Yes, Amos says, Yahweh brought Israel out of the land of Egypt and has a special covenant kinship relationship with Israel. In 3:2, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. But Yahweh also brought other peoples from various places, the Cushites, Ethiopians or Nubians or Midianites, Philistines, and Arameans or Syrians, see 9:7. This shows God's management of affairs elsewhere. In fact, in 9:8, Amos adds, quote, "The eyes of the Lord Yahweh are upon the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from the face of the earth, except that I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob, says Yahweh," unquote. So, as is commonly understood in pre-exilic Israel, Yahweh destroys the sinful kingdoms of other nations. Amos's universalism thus complements his view of Israel's election. Yahweh is judge of the nations. Now, there's a text in the Hebrew Bible where Yahweh used to delegate oversight of other nations to other members of the divine council. I'm speaking of Psalm 82. But even in that text, Yahweh still retained ultimate authority as judge of all the earth. Here, Yahweh is judging the other members of the council for judging unjustly in the oversight of the nations. Obviously, Yahweh is showing concern for morality in other nations here. The psalm concludes, quote, "Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you." You see, Yahweh owns all the nations. Let's recap. 4 points that shatter McClellan's ridiculous claim that the sex prohibitions in Leviticus 18 and 20 are morally irrelevant outside the land of Israel. First, it's not the venue of the land of Israel that makes these toavot abhorrent and detestable to God and to his holiness, but rather it's the nature of the acts themselves. Having sex with one's mother or child, another man's wife, an animal, or with another male is offensive to Yahweh regardless of where it is committed or by whom. Secondly, the statement opening Leviticus 18, "You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt," presupposes that Yahweh finds detestable and abhorrent the incest, adultery, bestiality, man-male intercourse, and child sacrifice committed by Egyptians in the land of Egypt. Thirdly, an absence of uniform judgment is not the same as an absence of uniform morality. The fact that Israel has no power to implement capital sentencing on other nations is not proof that these acts are not egregious sins outside the land of Israel in Yahweh's eyes. Fourth, there are biblical texts, including pre-exilic biblical texts, showing that Yahweh had ultimate oversight over the whole world, not just Israel. So obviously the sex prohibitions in Leviticus 18 and 20 aren't limited to the land of Israel, at least as moral standards. Now let's move on to our fifth point. Jews later, in the exilic and post-exilic periods, but also the Second Temple period, but also the Rabbinic period, Jews later in all of these periods universally understood, no dissenting voice, that man-male intercourse, incest, adultery, bestiality, and child sacrifice are morally wrong for the nations as well, not just for God's people. And early Christians had the same view. Certainly Jews outside of Palestine, those in the Babylonian exile, or in Egypt, or in the Greco-Roman diaspora, did not exempt themselves from the sex laws in Leviticus 18 and 20, just because they were outside the land of Israel. For example, Ezekiel, who straddled the pre-exilic and exilic periods, certainly believed that to be so. With time, Israel's role in enlightening the religious and moral sensibilities of Gentile nations came increasingly into view. We see this in the Isaianic vision of Israel's mission to be, quote, a light to the nations, which includes a mission to have the Torah, or the teaching or law of God, go out to the nations, and an expectation of the nations streaming to Jerusalem to receive that teaching. Since God's moral standards are a good for Israel, they are surely a good for the nations as well. The book of Jonah, written in the Persian period, is a monument to God's concern for the repentance of the nations. Philo, Josephus, and other Jewish figures of the first century criticized the sexual mores of Gentiles, especially the pursuit of passions for members of the same sex. Rabbis over time developed what we call Noahide laws. Think of Noah. Laws that are binding also on Gentiles, among which the prohibition of homosexual practice figured particularly strongly. The apostolic decree cited in Acts 15 required that Gentiles abstain from porneia, sexual immorality, which would have included the sex offenses in Leviticus 18 that were also enjoined on resident aliens. Paul, in Romans 1, verses 18 and 32, could speak of God's wrath upon Gentiles for their deliberate sinning against their knowledge of the truth, accessible in the material realm of creation, still extant in nature, particularly the commission of idolatry and same-sex intercourse. This wrath was manifested in God not disciplining the nations initially, but rather allowing them to heap up their sins and resulting in cataclysmic destruction on the day of the Lord's coming for judgment over all the nations of the earth. The fact that God is not disciplining the nations for their sins, as he does his own people, does not mean, contrary to what McClellan thinks, that God will not judge the nations for those sins. The prophet John of Patmos in the book of Revelation presents the great end times judgment of the nations as a referendum on Gentile morality, including abominable sexual practices. See 21:8 and 21:17 and 22:15. In short, no Jew or Christian adopted the interpretation that McClellan insists on, that the sex prohibitions in Leviticus 18 and 20 were morally irrelevant outside the land of Israel. Not a single one. We can see after this fivefold argument that McClellan did not latch on to the view that the sex laws in Leviticus 18 and 20 had no moral relevance outside the land of Israel because this was the best option dictated to him by the data. It wasn't the data that led him to this problematic interpretation. It was his LGBTQ dogma, the desire to deny that it had any relevance as universal morality. While the civil penalty of capital punishment is obviously bound to the existence of Israel as a theocratic state, the clear implication of these proscriptions is that God detests bestiality, man-male intercourse, incest, adultery, and child sacrifice, and holds culpable at some level those who commit it, irrespective of where it is committed, whether the Holy Land or elsewhere, and who commits it, whether Jews or Gentiles. Thanks for hearing me out. God bless. Do be sure to check out my other responses to Dan McClellan on my YouTube page, especially my 2 responses to him on Jesus and homosexuality. Take care.